Let's speak now to Dennis Raver. He is a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. He joins us virtually. Good morning to you, Mr. Raver. Thank you for your time.
Good morning.
Let me begin from something that I'm a bit confused about. Russia is under Western sanctions, which are affecting its economy, but yet Mr. Stoltenberg, as we've just reported, of NATO, is asking that Russia should lift the embargo on Ukraine's ports to allow the export of grain. Is that something that you think could actually happen?
Well, this is an interesting question, and I think it's a very interesting game that is being played right now. You see, it has been a strategy of Russia for a while to sort of create artificial crises and then insert itself into this crisis to be seen as to be providing a solution. The grain crisis, the food crisis that is unfolding right now in the eastern Ukraine is entirely artificial. So although the ports, the important ports in the east, the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol are currently under Russian control, the port of Odessa is not. And the port of Odessa is one of the main ports for export of grain. And so it's being blockaded by Russian forces. The notion is then that Russia is trying to create this crisis situation to force, essentially to force Ukraine to sit at the negotiation table and to force other countries to influence Ukraine due to the unfolding crisis. However, this strategy may backfire because the strategy is based on the idea that the Western countries will feel pressured and then would pressure Ukraine in turn. However, another aspect that has come recently is the discussion around potentially unblocking the ports, essentially creating a corridor for the grain to leave Ukrainian ports, for Ukrainian grain to leave the Ukrainian ports. And so if that is to happen, it is hard to say whether Russia would be ready to actually increase the hostilities in the region and actually confront an international flotilla or NATO forces at sea that are trying to deblocate this area. So it is a serious situation, but I feel that the Russian plan to create this crisis may actually backfire.
Let's discuss NATO a little bit, shall we? Because that is also the other leg of what's happening with this war in Ukraine. Finland and Sweden are trying to join NATO, but it requires the unanimity of all the current members for any new members to join, because the key plank of it, of course, is that if one is attacked, everybody else comes to its aid. But Turkey is opposed to this, and two delegations, as we've just reported, are in the Turkish capital to discuss this. But last week we reported that the Turkish president had said he didn't want to see them anyway and that they shouldn't waste their time. So what has changed from last week to now that makes these delegations believe that anything different is going to happen?
Well, again, it's very interesting because prior to that, we heard from the president of Finland that he had a discussion with Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and that Erdogan supported Finland's bid to become a member of NATO. And then the position changed. So we need to remember that Erdogan is a very savvy politician. He's very good at putting Turkish interests first. And because NATO is such a diverse group of countries, I think the internal interests would differ. And so Turkey is trying to use this opportunity to essentially achieve its domestic objectives and its foreign policy objectives, especially the ones that are related to northern Syria and the operation of Kurdish troops in the northern Syria, which are perceived as terrorist group. As a terrorist group by Turkey, but are not perceived as such by Finland and Sweden and other NATO member states. So it's obvious that some sort of an agreement will come out. The whole purpose of this is to arrive at some sort of an agreement that would benefit Turkey. So in exchange of Turkey allowing for both countries to proceed with the application.
You are in Pretoria in South Africa, and South Africa is one of very few countries that has chosen, shall we say, a middle path here, not blaming anyone and emphasizing, at least officially, the path of peace. Being there and being on the ground there, do you see this as a path that possibly is viable and that others should follow, especially given the fact that militarily the situation seems to be approaching a stalemate now, and that so diplomacy and the battle for peace seems to be the way to go?
Yeah. While I understand where these arguments are coming from, I don't necessarily think that peace negotiations in the way that are being discussed right now is a viable option for both countries. I mean, we need to remember that any peace negotiations would require a form of consensus from both parties. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And if we look at, for instance, at the surveys that has been carried in Russia and in Ukraine in terms of the way both population in both countries perceive the goals and objectives of this war, you would see that Ukrainians in large numbers oppose any sort of concession or any sort of concession that would require Ukraine to give up land. And that obviously includes the Donbas region and the Crimean Peninsula. So Ukrainians would object to anything that would include them giving land, and the Russians on the opposite side, I believe the latest polls that were from April, and this is the latest ones we have, indicate that around 86% of population support the Russian war in Ukraine. So I don't think that any of the parties at the current state are ready to start the negotiations, which is obviously an important basis for an agreement. However, what I think is it is obvious that in Russia, there is a deep understanding that Russia requires time. We need to remember that Russia never planned to have this prolonged war, and this is the third month of the war right now. They were not ready to engage in the war for so long. Their economy is not ready, and the military wasn't ready either. And so what we're seeing right now is exactly Russia attempting to create opportunities that would bring Ukraine to the table and force some sort of a negotiation. I don't think these efforts will succeed, and at this rate, I believe, as was mentioned, that a lot will be decided on the battlefield and the positions of both parties in the battlefield in the east, around Severodonetsk, around Slavyansk. If Russian forces will successfully encircle Ukrainian troops inside, we may see some sort of a ceasefire or negotiations restarting again. But at this stage, I don't think the parties are ready to negotiate, and neither Russia nor Ukraine are ready to concede or sacrifice any of the objectives that they have.
Let me ask you a related matter that has now come up. Of course, everybody who was looking at the war in Ukraine was talking about, in quiet circles, the big elephant that was in the room but was not seen to be in the room, and that was China and the situation with Taiwan, and that China was looking at this carefully as possibly a precedent if it had to do what it had always said it would do with reference to Taiwan. But during the course of this week, the US president who visited Asia had said that unlike in Ukraine, the United States would intervene militarily to back Taiwan if it was attacked by China. Do you think that changes the dynamic? Because that is definitely a shift in policy.
I believe after saying that, he was very careful to explain his position in more detail, because for many years, the US policy was to not have a policy, to have a very ambiguous policy towards Taiwan. It's definitely a very difficult question. I think China is looking at the war in Ukraine, and they're trying to see what worked and what didn't work to draw lessons. I think if Russian military offensive in Ukraine went according to the plan, I think that would have increased the chances for the war. I think looking at the international response and sanctions and the failure of Russian military to achieve their main and sort of initial objectives, China would be cautious to start a war, especially given that Taiwan is an island. It creates all kinds of military difficulties in terms of trying to capture it. I think at the same time, however, as U.S. and Europe are engaged in the war in Ukraine in terms of their diplomatic efforts and support in terms of resources and military support, I think it's very important, and what the Americans are trying to do right now is to indicate that despite them being very busy, they would not tolerate any sort of conflict emerging in that area of the world, and because the fear would be that if the U.S. is distracted, China may use this as an opportunity to advance. But I don't think at this moment in time it's a realistic development.
You research a lot and you see a lot of the trends, you're watching a lot of the trends, and therefore I think this, my final question would probably be right along your alley. It seems as if post the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when a lot of people were talking about a unipolar world where there was just one superpower, we seem to be returning, albeit to a multipolar world where there are several points of power now as the world is shaping out in terms of content. Do you think that that puts us in more danger because you have a couple of power points as opposed to one power point? And what I mean by that is, if you take the UN Security Council, it has 5 members, but it now seems to be clear that you have Western members and you have Eastern members, Russia and China on the East, the United States, Britain and France on the West, and that therefore any world issue is likely to be looked at from this prism.
I see what you're asking. It's an interesting question, definitely, and I don't think there is a straight or a simple answer to that. On the one hand, of course, multipolarity allows for more voices to be heard and more an exchange of views and perception, which is important. On the other hand, of course, it weakens some of the institutions that we have, and I think the multipolar world worked until the 24th of February this year, when Russia unilaterally, without a mandate or a permission or general sort of reason, decided to invade a neighboring country. And that shows the dangers of the other side of the multipolar world, is that if a country decides to pursue these actions unilaterally in this multipolar world, and it doesn't meet enough resistance, it may actually create a very dangerous situation, not just for neighboring countries, but as you know, with the food shortage and the spiking petrol prices around the world, it may create more unstable environments. So, provided that the countries that are part of this multipolar world are acting in accordance with the general rules that we have all prescribed to, the UN rules, I think it can be a more peaceful world. However, there are dangers, as we can see.
I'm sure a lot of those who are listening and watching you would say a big amen to those your last sentences. Thank you very much, Dennis River, for your time on the program. Dennis River, of course, researcher at the Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria. Thank you very much.
Thank you.